What would it be like if you could read other people's minds? If you could tell with 100% certainty whether or not a person is lying? What would it be like if you were able to know exactly who a person was within seconds of meeting them? Well, none of that is really possible. And if anyone ever tells you it is possible, oh, I read the way in which they look this way and this means all this about them, then don't believe them. But you can believe me in telling you that over the course of this episode of the Changing Minds podcast, we are going to go into how to read anyone. I'm going to walk you through the most important things you need to know to become really good at reading the people that you meet. So often we talk about reading people, it's like, notice their body language. Are their arms crossed? If so, this tells you this. Or their eyes looked in that direction. That immediately means that they are a psychopath and they're going to murder you. Now, if when their eyes go that way, they're also holding on to the head of some, corpse and they're holding on to a knife, then they might be a psychopath. But if they're not holding on to the head of the corpse and they're not holding on to a bloody knife, probably just because their eyes are moving, they're not. So there are certain things that are like big clues, like the whole corpse head and the bloody knife, especially bloody, that give you the clue. Other things, just looking in a different direction, not so much. But we will, in this episode, be looking at everything you need to know about reading people. So by the end of it, you will know if the person that you're spending your life with is a psychopath. No, I'm joking, of course. Of course. That will be one of the benefits, but there's going to be other benefits as well. Overall, this is going to be a very fun episode. So get ready to learn to read people. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. I'm Owen Fitzpatrick, and today we're going to talk about reading people. Now, this topic, I am sure, is going to be ridiculously useful for you, whether there are people that you know for a while, for all your life, or people that you're just meeting for the very first time. We'll look at the clues that people give you, the signals that people deliberately try to put across to you, and we'll also understand the concept of deep empathy. We'll finish off by looking at pretentiousness and how this relates to authenticity, and offer you strategies that you can use to immediately read anyone better. And we'll talk first about why it would be useful, as in why bother learning to be really good at reading people. And let's start, if it's okay, with looking at some of those benefits that you will get. Why does reading people matter so much? Well, first of all, it allows you to navigate the social interaction that you have. It allows you to be able to build better relationships, build better friendships. It allows you to be able to meet more people, create better networks that are good for your overall organizational development, that are good for your ability to succeed in business. It allows you to be able to tell more easily when people are lying, although it's not 100% by any means or even close to it. There's, by the way, two different elements, I may as well tell you this now, two elements that are most important about reading people when it comes to lying or deception. The first is what we call congruence, and this means do their body, their voice, the words that they use, they all line up together? Or is their body language or voice tone or words, do they say something different? Are they what we call incongruent? And the other one is the clusters of information that we get. So we get a bunch of clues. And if you get a number of different signals that suggest that a person is lying, then that is indicative that they are in fact lying. So what's really important to recognize is that deception is not something we can just figure out based upon one thing. It's not like people scratch their cheek whenever they lie. It's more a case of that they do a number of things. And really what you're looking for is you're looking for a movement away from the default. So just like poker, when someone bluffs, you notice that whenever they tell the truth, they have a certain body language. Whenever they bluff, they have a certain body language. The difference between those two becomes the evidence that you need, becomes the clue. So in other words, you're working off different defaults, so it's not a universal thing. It's not that everyone who lies always does X. And that's the first little micro lesson we'll talk about. But it allows you to navigate social interactions. It also helps you to avoid manipulation, being manipulated by others, enhances your relationships, helps you to motivate people more effectively, helps you to figure out what people think of you as well. You can read how other people are perceiving you, which is great for a sort of what we call an external self-awareness. It allows you to improve yourself and also ensures that you're able to become more authentic and you can spot someone pretentious a mile away. And that's particularly important. So we have loads of reasons why we want to get better at reading people. I do want to touch on a little bit of the neuroscience behind reading people. There is a number of things that we've talked about before. For example, mirror neurons. This is something we also discuss on another episode of the Change Your Minds podcast when we talk about storytelling. And in this context, mirror neurons are really, when you are reading people, when you're trying to understand people, part of your capacity or ability to read people is based upon what we call a theory of mind. That's your ability to put yourself in another person's shoes and understand how they must be feeling, that there is another human being there. And mirror neurons suggest that our brain tends to represent what's happening for another person in the same way as if we were doing it. So when we watch someone do something, we imagine vividly like we're doing it as well. And so the same kind of part of our brain lights up in the person taking the actions. And this makes it easier for us to understand other people and put ourselves in their shoes, which in turn helps with regards to reading them. There's also emotional processing that happens in the brain. There's obviously different areas of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex up at the front. There's the insula, which really is one of the areas of the brain responsible for figuring out what's going on in the body and figuring out what we're actually feeling. There's the anterior cingulate cortex, which is also responsible for some of this understanding and regulating our emotions. There's the amygdala, which is the signal that allows us to know when we meet a person. Whenever we get some sort of new stimulus in our environment, it allows us to go, is this something to be threatened by, or is this something positive? So it's like an alarm system when we meet people for the first time. And then we also have language processing. So the brain doesn't just take in language or process language. It also will look at the body language. It will look at the voice tone. So our brain doesn't just listen to words most of the time. It evaluates the meaning of the communication based upon a combination of the body language, the tone of voice, and the words themselves. So if your partner says to you and you say, "How are you doing, sweetheart?" and they say, "Fine," then you don't go, "Great, they said fine, that's wonderful. Oh, I'm so glad." Instead, your heart starts beating fast, you're in trouble, and you start to panic. Why do you start to panic? It's because as your brain internalizes the fine, the tone of voice, the facial expression, all of that creates nuanced meaning for the word, and therefore that means that we're figuring out what they're actually really saying as opposed to what we think that they're saying at that moment in time. So it's important to recognize that. And the brain's ability to read people is also influenced by learning. So our beliefs can often skew the way in which we interpret someone's behavior. So, for example, you're culturalized by growing up in one country. If you, for example, grew up in Ireland, you might be quite sensitive to a certain way of being. And when someone then is very, let's say, confident or talks about how great they are, that becomes something very negative. At least what we've grown up with in Ireland is whenever someone's very positive about themselves, we see that as being quite negative because it's like arrogance. We very quickly turn that into arrogance, even if it's just confidence. And therefore, it's something that immediately will be influenced by the stories that we've been told and the culturalization that has influenced the way in which you interpret that behavior. So culture's affected, personality's affected, the kind of person that you are, the kind of parents you grew up with, all of those will influence how you interpret the behavior of others. So it can actually skew and affect the perception that you have of what they are, who they are, what they mean. And that's something we have to recognize, is that part of reading people is recognizing that there are certain biases that we will have that will negatively impact our ability to be objectively good enough to figure out who a person is, why they're saying what they're saying, whether or not we should trust them. And so again, let's imagine you've had a few bad experiences. You've been let down by a lot of people, right? All men are X, all women are X. You immediately in your mind think to yourself, you cannot trust a person in a relationship. Then unfortunately, what that will lead you to is you'll fall into the trap of then generalizing that. And then when you meet someone, they'll immediately fall into, just because of their gender, they'll fall into this trap. They'll fall into your mental belief, the story you tell yourself about this group of people, which means you're going to be less able to actually read them. And so the first lesson towards reading people better is to recognize what stereotypical perspective do you already hold? What biases do you have coming into the conversations or the meeting with them? What beliefs are already being formed about the person based on little evidence? The more you recognize the biases you might have, the more you can avoid allowing them to negatively skew the way in which you're reading them at that moment in time. So that's an important thing to do. So let's get into what I call the 4 types of text. And again, I'm not saying you text lol, OMG, I love you so much, ILY. I don't know why I'm speaking like that, but the text language where people are like texting like, acronyms and whatnot. Well, that's not the type of text I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here is the notion that we have the text is the actual message that you're communicating. The subtext is the meaning behind the text. So if I say to you, let's imagine I say to you, I love you, right? If I say I love you, maybe it means I love you. Or maybe I'm just telling you I love you to shut you up, right? So if I go, look, I love you, okay? That's a different sort of way of putting that across. So the text might say I love you, but the subtext might say, look, I love you, but I'm so sick and tired of you asking this question. Would you ever shut up? And you can tell that by the way in which I've communicated that message. In The Godfather, he says, we'll make him an offer he can't refuse. That's not a good message, right? The message is, we'll make him an offer he can't refuse, but it's not good for the person who's getting the offer, right? It's the subtext is, we're going to threaten him. Or he'll sleep with the fishes. Again, that means he could be found dead in the bottom of the lake. Or, in certain cases, wake up with a big fish in the bed, which is again a threat. The point is, the text is what you say, the subtext is what you mean. And we know what the person means based upon the tone of voice, the facial expression, and the third type of text after text and subtext, which is the context. So the context of a situation will determine what a particular phrase means. If you say no in one context, that could be very, very different in a different context. When people say I was taken out of context, in other words, they say something, they get in trouble for saying something, and people lose it over the fact that they've said it. Oftentimes they say it was taken out of context because from their point of view, something that they said that makes sense and is not offensive when they said it, that word, that term, that phrase, that sentence is being taken out, extracted, and placed in a different context where now suddenly it becomes offensive. And this is the danger of technology. Now we live in a world where AI is getting to the point where it's going to be so good, it's going to be able to impersonate us and make all of us potentially offensive. But what's really important here to understand is you need to know the context for you to understand the subtext. Let me say that again. You need to know the context for you to understand the subtext. And then the final type of text is the supertext. And this is really the overarching message. What is the agenda? What is the main theory, right? In a TED Talk, for example, in Simon Sinek's TED Talk, What Great Leaders Do to Inspire Action, the supertext is start with why. So it's the core overarching text. All the text serves that supertext, which is the core message you're trying to communicate. So you got the core message you're trying to communicate. You got the context, which are all the contextual variables, the culture, the environment, what's happened just beforehand, what mood the person's in, a whole bunch of things that's going to influence what the communication means. The text is what's actually said, and the subtext is the meaning. So the context determines the subtext, and the text and the context mixed lead into this subtext, which in turn aligns with the supertext. And the subtext is the blow-by-blow meaning of everything that you're saying. The supertext is the overarching message that everything feeds into. And why I started with the 4 types of text is when you're reading people, it's important for you to stop and ask yourself, how aligned is the text and the subtext? What is the context of this situation, right? So why is the person saying what they're saying? And everything we talk about, when we talk about the clues of others, which is what we're going to get into in a moment, we need to recognize that the clues of others are only clues whenever we take into consideration all of the different factors as to why they're communicating that way in this situation. So we need to recognize, how do we expect people will communicate and how are they communicating based on the context? And if there's a discrepancy between how they're communicating and how we expect them to communicate, all bets are off. Now we know, okay, something else is going on here. We need to figure out what that is. So let's get into the clues of other people. And we'll start with body language, right? And there's a lot of myths about body language. It's always like, okay, well, if your body is pointing in this direction, or if you use this gesture, if you scratch your nose, if you blink your eyes 3 times, if you do this, if you look up to the left, there's the I-axis and cues in NLP. And a lot of people misunderstand body language and immediately take one signal, one clue, and assume that that clue means something. So when it comes to the I-axis and cues of NLP, in a nutshell, this suggests that when people look up to the left, up to the right, down to the left, down to the right, over to the left, over to the right, that suggests they're making images, remembering images, they're constructing images, they're remembering sounds, constructing sounds, talking to themselves, or getting feelings, right? Different things that are going on. But you don't know, just because someone's constructing something, whether or not they're imagining the future. You don't know whether or not they're lying. Because oftentimes when we think about the past, we construct the past. We don't just remember what happened. We reconstruct the past. It's a much more accurate way of saying it. Our memories are not as accurate as we think they are. So with that in mind, when we read body language, we need to look for, as I mentioned earlier, the clusters. We have to look for the poses. The poses will give us some sense as to whether or not this person is friend or foe, as to whether this person is trying to present themselves as dominant or not, right? So whenever someone stands up tall or strong and moves out and occupies a lot of space in the room, that suggests that they're attempting to demonstrate dominance, that they want to show power. And that also tells you that they need to feel power, which immediately, if you look at someone who's trying to be dominant, that indicates that for them, power is a huge thing. They want to be looked at as being strong and tough and confident and powerful. And they're petrified of not being looked in that way. And so when you start to look at a person acting in that context, that immediately gives you an idea as to what their needs are, what they're trying to do, what they're trying to, as we call it, and we'll talk about this later, signal. So it's useful to watch when a person tries to exert dominance through their body language. There's also the emotions that they feel. We can tell by the way in which a person communicates with their body language. Often we get clues as to what their emotions are. Now, these are not as universal as we once thought. Paul Ekman, a lot of his work looked at the universal different types of emotions, but Lisa Feldman Barrett, neuroscientist extraordinaire, identified that there's a lot that we don't know actually about the generality of emotions, and in many cases, we construct emotions based upon the situations we find ourselves in. And it's not that these emotions are general, they happen to us, it's that we create them. And as such, we can't be too sure that the emotions that we assume people are experiencing are actually those emotions. And I know that myself from whenever I'm delivering trainings or talks, sometimes I assume someone is not happy with what I'm saying, but yet that's just their concentration face. So you might be listening to me and you might be going, if you're listening to an audio, I'm just making ridiculous faces now. And yet still, even though you're making that facial expression right now, you're loving it. You're loving the episode. You're going, oh, this is brilliant. But your face is not telling me. It's like your voice and your face are two different things. Your voice is saying, I'm enjoying it, but your face is saying, oh my goodness, it's going crazy. So with that in mind, it's important to recognize that we can tell a little bit, we can hazard a guess, form hypotheses about what we think a person's feeling, but we can also notice by the level of energy that they have how important this is. The energy a person demonstrates by the way in which they use their body will give us some clues. Also, the eye contact a person makes with us will indicate maybe a level of confidence, a level of focus. And we're also influenced whenever we perceive someone is looking at us. So research shows that even when we perceive a painting is looking at us, so when we look at a painting, they did this fascinating study in a museum where they put a $20 note or whatever it was in front of a painting, and they had two conditions. One of the conditions was the painting was a picture of a woman that was looking away. And in the other condition, there was a picture of a woman that was looking directly at you, so Mona Lisa-esque. And they found that whenever the eyes were looking directly at them, people were significantly more likely to hand the money in. But whenever the eyes were looking away, it's almost like the painting can't see me, I'm just going to take this up. And they were able to sneak it. And they had like cameras and stuff like that. So just if you're ever walking in a museum and you're going past a painting and there's money on the ground, probably a psychology experiment. So don't take the cash. Anyway, micro-expressions are also something people talk about. This is, again, popularized by the work of Ekman. There used to be a great show called Lie to Me. It was like a TV show about Ekman's work, that there's flashes that you show. Once again, different research sort of argues for and against it. I'm not going to go into micro-expressions too much. There might be something to it, but what I will say is that there's a lot of other ways that we can become better at learning to read people. So I've done a few of the courses. I studied some micro-expression courses. I became quite good at reading them, but at the same time, there's a lot more easy ways to be able to read people than trying to figure out what happened in that flash of a second as they were communicating. There's also the expressiveness. How expressive is someone? That can indicate how excited they are sometimes, but again, that can be cultural as well. So once again, you're dealing with the default of how they normally express themselves versus how they're expressing themselves here, and you're paying attention to whatever information that you can get in this moment in time. There's also the voice tone that we use. So it's the voice that you hear a person use, and this is really, are they speaking quite fast? That can indicate, for instance, that they are thinking quite quickly, that they're in a hurry, that they're in a rush. You could even hypothesize, I suppose, that they're type A personality, that they're more likely to be stressed than someone who's speaking slowly. But how fast they talk can give you certain clues. Again, remember, they're only clues. This should not be used to diagnose. You just go, they're clues. Another indication from a tone of voice, if someone's quite quiet, that indicates maybe they're not as confident. They can be a little bit more introverted, for instance. If they're loud, well, obviously that means that they're more likely, again, more likely to be extrovert than they are to be introvert. If, for instance, they spend a lot of time making verbal tics, so they go, well, that indicates that it's either a verbal habit or a verbal pattern, or it indicates that they're nervous, or it indicates that they're trying to find the right words, and finding the right words is important to them. Therefore, they use these filler words accordingly. If they stumble through things and rethink things, or if they use very conditional language or very careful language, like I think maybe the possibility is we might want to consider X, Y, and Z, then that indicates that they're not very certain and not very definite, and they're very careful to make sure that they don't say the wrong thing. Or it could indicate that they're perfectionists and they want to make sure that they're exactly accurate all the time. Therefore, they're being as conditional as possible. Whereas other people might use more certain language. Absolutely, certainly, totally. Or they might use hyperbole, right? So this could be someone who's using lots of exaggeration. And there's plenty of people, because unfortunately, the social media algorithms tend to reward hyperbole, tend to reward extreme communication. So the words we use tend to matter. The vocabulary we use, right? What kind of vocabulary are we using? Do we have a lot of technical words? Do you use a lot of multisyllabic words? If you listen to Jordan Peterson versus, let's say, Donald Trump, and again, not commenting on either one, right? Not saying anything, so don't come after me in the comments. Oh, I can't believe you. Whatever side you're, I don't care. Donald Trump and Jordan Peterson, if you do analysis of their language, you'll find that Jordan Peterson uses a lot more syllables in his language than Donald Trump does, right? And they might agree on a lot of the issues, but I'm just saying one person is a different type of vocabulary than the other. And that, again, will give you information. Doesn't even necessarily always touch on whether or not one person's more intelligent, because there's different forms of intelligence. And just because you use bigger words doesn't necessarily mean that you're smarter than the average bear that, in bears' cases, can't use any words. Although I'm sure most people are smarter than the average bear, but I haven't seen bears do IQ tests. So, and even IQ isn't a good measurement. Bears are probably smarter with killing squirrels. I don't know. Do they kill squirrels? Probably bears kill. I can't imagine. Do bears kill? I wonder if they kill squirrels. That's going to be after something I chat GPT after this episode. There's also the grammar we use. And the kind of language we use. Sometimes we might use certain types of grammar to indicate, again, different ages, different generations will often have a certain way of talking, certain words that they use that other generations don't get. I won't try to embarrass you by trying to come up with some Generation Z language, but I'm just saying, I think I've got lots of riz. So that means charisma. So therefore, I'm not going to bother doing that, because I think this podcast episode, it's lit. I know by making that gesture, I've made it even worse and more embarrassing. So we'll have to tone down the cringe. But it's the words that we use. Also, the use of swear words, for example, that again will tell people something about you. A lot of people will say it tells something really bad about you. Other people will say it tells something really good about you. Mark Manson would suggest you're getting straight to the point, and Gary Vaynerchuk would agree. Other people who don't like the notion of swear words would see it as bad indication of the kind of person that you are. Whatever. Again, we're not interpreting this, and we're not assuming that this means something about you. We're just noticing what clues it gives us about the way in which you think and the way in which you act and how you come across. There's also the words we don't use. So sometimes, for example, if someone is always full of hyperbole and they're like, oh my goodness, Owen, you're the best, you're amazing, you super. And then I show them a podcast episode and I'm like, what do you think? And then they go, yeah, it was good. It's not good. If they say it's good, and normally they're like, oh, it's amazing, you're superb, you're fantastic. If they say it's good, what they're not saying is they're not saying it's amazing. So next time anyone in your life ever tells you that was a good job, lose it. Lose it with them. I can't believe it. You didn't tell me it was amazing. You didn't tell me it was superb. You don't like me. You don't love me anymore. Are we even together? Obviously, don't say any of that. I'm joking. I'm saying don't say that, right? Don't. even if it's the truth. Now, I'm joking, it's not the truth. But what is the truth is that oftentimes by what a person doesn't say, they give you a clue as to what they're actually thinking. And so we need to recognize, what would we expect them to say versus what did they say? And then there's a gap, and we have to ask then, why? And that's what we then need to look at the other clues to help us figure that out. Next is the stories we tell. So whenever you listen to a person's stories, how do they position themselves? Remember, as we talked about in the storytelling episode, we continuously position ourselves in the mind of other people. So other people will create a perspective in which they perceive us to be a certain type of person. And so when we create that in our own mind, this image of this person inside our head, they can influence that by the stories that they tell at this moment. So we need to recognize, what is the story that they're telling and how are they positioning themselves in the story? How do they want us to see them? Because it's not that the stories will indicate something about them. Most of the time, the stories will indicate how they want us to see them. That's what we're looking for. The stories a person tells you reveals how they want you to see them. And that's what's important. Next, places we go. So whatever places they go to, whatever countries they visit, whatever places they go on vacation, on holiday, that will indicate more about them. Where do they go to have fun? Where do they go to relax? All of that will give you an indication as to the kind of person they are, the taste they have, what kind of things they like. Do they like the opera? Do they like comedy? Do they like dark comedy? Do they like plays? Do they like movies? Do they like football? Do they like UFC? Like, the more that you understand what they like, the more that helps you to paint a picture of the kind of person they are. Things we recommend. So if they recommend something to you, then once again, that tells you that they really value that. So the person tells you about a certain comedian, you go along to see it, and it was like really like messed up humor. Now you know that they've got a great sense of humor. So now you know that they've got a messed up sense of humor, which in turn helps indicate more information about them. How they look, this is about how they dress, for example, right? So what do they wear and how do they wear it as well? So you could look at their age and how do most people their age normally, what kind of clothes do they normally wear? And how does this person dress accordingly? Sometimes people don't, inverted commas, dress their age. And that's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. Again, I want us to all avoid this tendency we have to judge. Because if you notice, every time I sort of talk about reading, there's a possibility for us to use that as a way to beat someone up. Right? Oh, they're dressing like this. Oh, they look like, oh, they like this stuff. Oh, they're this political affiliation. All of that makes it easy for us to instantly start to go, this person is just like that. And we generalize straight away. And what I want us to do is to avoid making that mistake, avoid falling into that trap. And instead simply notice, what are some of the clues that dressing like that tends to suggest for us? Who do they follow online? What political affiliation do they have? What side are they on? I suppose is unfortunately the way to put it. Once again, we don't jump to a conclusion about what that means. We just notice what are the clues we can get about what's really important to them. We can hazard a guess that there are solid enough clues, like the overwhelming majority of people that believe in this particular religion or are on this political side or whatever, or follow this particular figure, tend to also believe X. But there's also stuff that we immediately will lump in there, and we will take especially if we don't like the person or don't like the religion or don't like the political party, we'll instantly then find lots of other stuff that will stick in there as well. And so it's important for us to recognize we're just getting clues, and we want to evaluate how accurate those clues more than likely are. We also want to know their personality, right? How extrovert they are, or are they introverted? Are they quite disciplined and organized and conscientious? Or they pretty much go with the flow? Are they quite neurotic? Do they get upset about things, quite emotional? Or are they quite like logical on the other side? And once again, none of these are good or bad. But we're looking at how open they are, how conservative they are, how limited, closed they are to new ideas, how much they like their own voice, how much they like to listen, how polite they are, how nice they are, how direct they are, how indirect they are. A whole host of things that can once again give us more information that allows us to understand the person more effectively. We can also tell a little bit about the person, about the accent they have. And that accent, once again, will bring with it stereotypes. So we want to avoid falling for those stereotypes. But nonetheless, there are certain things about a person's accent that can reveal a little bit more about the background that they grew up in and the way in which they learned English, which then in turn will influence how they actually communicate and give us an indication as to how they see the world, right? Because people from Russia, people from Japan, people from China, people from Australia, people from Italy, people from Colombia, people from Brazil, people from America, people from Ireland, all have been brought up and culturalized in different ways. So therefore, we have to recognize that there's going to be some cultural differences. And when a person has a particular accent, that can indicate something about them. Again, these are indicators, these are simply clues. And finally, the things that we own and what we share online are two other clues as well. So if you see a person owns a Rolex watch, well, you can deduce a number of things from that. If you see a person has a big library, if you see a person has a fancy TV, if you see a person has a PlayStation, if you see a person has a beautiful bag, like all of these are things that we can infer that they value that and that they can afford that. And there's a whole host of things that we can conclude based upon those clues. But once again, we need to be taking a bunch of those clues in and always being open to it. And finally, what do we share online, as I mentioned? So what we share online really tells people what we like, what we think other people should see. And so you need to remember when you send a friend of yours a video or a reel, that very much indicates your sense of humor, very much indicates what you think is important, very much indicates what you think people should be watching. And so you tell people about yourself based upon what you share with them online. So they're the clues that you want to pay attention to. And remember, there's the clues of what people are trying to make you think versus what they're actually saying, like the difference between the story they tell you and what they're trying to make you believe about them, right? So there's those different clues that we can get, but there's also when people are deliberately trying to cultivate clues to make you think a certain way. And one example of this would be signaling, in the sense of how can I, when I'm communicating to you, let you know I'm a certain type of person. And the problem is that we can't turn around and go to people, or we can, but no one will listen. I'm a really, really great person. I mean, I'm very virtuous. I'm really good. Other people aren't. No, but I am. And I'm smart. A lot of people aren't smart. I'm smart. Super smart. And other people are not very good socially, not popular. I'm very popular. Very popular. If we communicated like that, it'd probably be more authentic if we believe that bullshit about ourselves. But if we communicated like that, let's just say nobody would take us seriously. And in fact, people would be more likely, if you say that you're smart, people immediately assume that you're probably stupid because no one says they're smart, or very few people do. So unless you're in an interview and they say, tell me your qualities, unless you're in that context, if you're in any other context, what's important to realize is that the way in which you'll try to communicate to them will be signaling. And by the way, before I get into it, we all do it. I signal all the time as well, right? And it's important to realize that you signal also. If you are the kind of person that doesn't signal, I promise you're signaling that you don't signal. It's one of those meta signals. So just be careful to not fall for the assumption that everybody else signals, but I don't. We all signal. The only question is, what are you signaling? And most importantly, because this is about reading people, what are other people signaling? So let me give you a few examples, a bunch of examples. One is virtue signaling. This is, I'm a good ethical person. So every time you see someone writing an email online about what they find disgusting, or about who they think should be cancelled, or why they think this person is wrong, or why this person shouldn't be given a platform, or whatever it is that they say, part of it might be actual frustration. Part of it might be that they actually genuinely think that it's wrong, that this person should be doing what they're doing, I'm sure. But also always a part of it is, I'm an ethical person. I'm so good. This person's bad. And this is one way that I get to tell the rest of the world that I'm a good person. When we write, which is meaningful, when we say, I stand with whoever the people experience tragedy, whether there's an earthquake, or there's poverty, or there's a war, whatever, and people are victims, and we go online and we post profile pictures of flags and we say, I stand with, or I am, whatever, that whole thing. Once again, I'm not saying that's wrong. And if you've done that, and I've probably done something similar before, then know this. It's not necessarily that it's a problem. Maybe it's a positive thing. Maybe it's going to do something. But make no mistake, you are virtue signaling. That's what you're doing. You're telling the world that you stand on this side, and what you're, in essence, the subtext of what you're saying is, I'm a good person. I'm an ethical person. The subtext is, and the other side are not. Now, when it's an earthquake, then I'm the kind of person that is standing with the victims of this earthquake. And anyone else who hasn't changed their profile picture or anyone else who hasn't put this on their profile, how do you live with yourself? You know? So the idea is that you're virtue signaling. You're signaling to the world, I am virtuous. Another one is I'm smart signaling. Whenever we use certain types of vocabulary, whenever we talk about the books we read, oh my goodness, I was just reading for the 5th time Dostoevsky. And oh my goodness, you know how brilliant he is? Now, maybe you are genuinely talking about Dostoevsky. And if you are, if you've read Anne Karenina 100 times and you love him and you think he's the best, great. Maybe that's true. But even if that's true, a lot of times when people say they love stuff, I'm skeptical if it's true. But even if that's true, even if you're the biggest Dostoevsky fan in the history of Dostoevskys, the truth of the matter is that you are still smart signaling. You're still trying to let the world know, I'm smart, I'm cultured, I read important books like those written by these geniuses and these wizards of the last couple of 100 years or whatnot. There's social signaling, there's I'm popular. And this is, you put on Facebook or whatever, pictures of you with your group, with your family. You put for the whole month, you say, oh, this is what we did this month, and you show lots of pictures. Look at me, I'm cool. And again, I do it myself sometimes. I'll have pictures of myself with an audience in some part of the world, and I'll be, look how popular I am. Like, we all do it. It's not a bad thing. But I want you to recognize the subtext is, hey, everyone, just to let you know, I'm cool. Like, I'm popular. Like, people find me popular. There's also attraction signaling. Go on Tinder, go on Hinge, go on Bumble, whatever the apps are. I guarantee you'll see all the photographs are trying to say, I'm attractive. Now, some of them will also say I'm popular. Some of them will also say I'm successful. Some will also, but what they're looking for is I'm attractive. So every time you turn your head to make sure that your selfie looks great, every time you get the person to take 16 photographs until you're happy with one, what you're doing is you're being very careful to make sure that the photo you send out to the world is signaling to the world, I'm attractive. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I want you to be aware of it. Every time a person signals to you something about them that tells you that that is important to them. For the virtue signals, being virtuous is important. They want you to see them as good. Now, there could be a theory to suggest that if you virtue signal all the time, that indicates that maybe, just maybe, you actually believe that you're not so good and you're trying to compensate. If you constantly need to look attractive, it might mean that you're very self-critical and therefore you feel unattractive and you try to compensate by trying to signal the fact that you're attractive. So there is that theory. But that's not necessarily always true either. But when you notice someone signaling, notice it, pay attention to it, and understand what's actually going on. Another one is financial signaling. And this is everything from I mentioned the Rolex, the watch you wear, the clothes that you wear, the car that you drive, whatever non-verbal ways to be able to signal that, but also what you say in conversations, right? When you talk about what you've bought, when you talk about where you go for vacation, when you talk about certain things, the very things that you say can often suggest that you are successful financially, which in that case is another example of financial signaling. Once again, not a bad thing per se. There's fit signaling, where you're talking about how fit you are. You talk nonstop about the gym. A lot of people in CrossFit will constantly talk about CrossFit. But again, it fits in with the identity of I'm a fit person. I want everyone to know. There's unique signaling, communicating to others that you're different, that you're weird, that you're unique, that there's nobody in the world like you. And the reality is there's no one in the world like anyone else. We're all unique. But if you're signaling constantly that you're unique, it suggests that being unique is one of the most important parts of your identity. There's group signaling. I'm part of this group. You'll see that all over social media, especially in election years. Every time they attack the other side, that's the group. And every time they defend the side, that's the group. Cultural signaling. Again, I'm cultured. You show yourself in fancy restaurants or reading poetry or something. Again, no disrespect. I love poetry. I think it's great. And fancy restaurants are great. I'm just saying, this is all signaling as well. Trend signaling, I'm up to the date with the latest trends. Creative signaling, I'm creative. I'm guilty of that as well. Adventure signaling, I'm adventurous. Again, I'm guilty of that with the trips. Whenever I talk about the trips I took around the world and all that. And environmental signaling, I'm environmentally conscious. So whenever you talk about the climate and all that sort of stuff, you're telling the world the climate's important to me. All of these are ways in which we signal to the world. And if you just pay more attention and ask yourself the question, what are they signaling? It will reveal a lot more about what's really going on for the other person. And this really links into the next piece where we'll talk about deep empathy. And deep empathy is the ability that you have to be able to really understand someone else. And there's a few things to look out for. Whenever you're trying to deeply empathize with someone, the first thing you want to understand is what is their overall goal? And that is what is it that they ultimately speaking want? What are they trying to achieve in their life? Or what are they trying to achieve in business? Then you want to know their agenda. And their agenda is, in this specific situation, this conversation with you, this interaction, what are they trying to achieve in this? So the goal is the overarching goal. The agenda is what do they want in the moment. So is the what do they want in general, what do they want in the moment is the agenda. Then there's their identity. How do they see themselves? And again, the signaling will help you to understand how they see themselves. What kind of personality do they see themselves as having? There's the problems that they have. What problems do they complain about? The worries that they have. What are they worried about that might happen in the future? What is the pain that they are feeling bad about? So in other words, what is the emotional feeling that they get as a result of having those problems or having those worries? What pain do they get from the problems that exist in their life? And then finally, what do they value? What's important to them? When you're listening to a person and you're just noticing what they want right now, how they see themselves, what problems do they have, what worries do they have, what pain do those problems cause for them, and what is important to them, that's deep empathy. That is you effectively becoming much better at stepping into their shoes and really understanding the kind of person that you're talking to. That, my friends, is you reading somebody. And the more that you can do that effectively, and by the way, you can't always guarantee that you're always going to get it right. So again, it's constantly forming hypotheses, getting clues, trying to figure it out, and testing it and checking it and seeing it. And as you do that, you'll start to notice patterns and you'll start to become a lot better at doing it effectively. And we'll bring this more towards a close as we talk about pretentiousness versus authenticity. And so when we talk about pretentiousness is really something used to describe behavior, speech, or actions where a person is trying to demonstrate or display how important they are, how sophisticated they are, how successful they are. They're trying to impress other people. In a nutshell, it's the over-indexing of signaling. It's when someone is signaling like crazy. Look how great I am. Look how important I am. That, in a nutshell, is pretentiousness. And why that's important to understand is that when people demonstrate pretentiousness, it doesn't come from nowhere. Oftentimes, the people most likely to be pretentious are people who are insecure. They're people who are in need of high social status, right? Because they feel that if they don't have high social status, they've nothing. So in other words, they very much value how society looks upon them. They very much value how strangers look at them. They very much value how people in their groups look at them. And so they do whatever it takes to demonstrate to that group, look how important and successful I am. So that's a form of insecurity. That's a need for attention. And so they do whatever they can to fake it because they want to be accepted. And this could be part of the cultural norm. It could be, this is the way we act as a result of this. So if you grow up in certain parts of the world, or you grow up in certain groups or communities, then you could learn that this is the way you're supposed to be. And I've no doubt there's certain parts of the world where, and certain parts of America, where you grow up and you act in a certain way because that's how everybody else acts. And you form an identity based upon what they expect of you. This is known as identity foreclosure. I've talked about it in a previous episode. And so what we need to recognize is that when we fall into this trap of trying to act like everyone else, simply because we want to create an impression in the mind of everyone else, it means we're constantly striving to be someone that we're not. And so the antidote to that is obviously being authentic. Now, the problem with being authentic is you can't be authentic on purpose. Why? Because being authentic just means being yourself. And you can't try to be yourself. You just have to be yourself. So being authentic means avoiding not being authentic. So in other words, it means avoiding faking it, avoiding going down the road of being pretentious. And that simply means understanding yourself, getting comfortable with yourself, and being able to discern the difference between pretending to be something like fake it till you make it versus acting as if. And that's an important distinction. A lot of people use them interchangeably, but I believe when you say fake it till you make it, the notion is that you're faking it. Whereas when you act as if, you're stepping into those shoes, you're practicing it, but you're not pretending to be something. Your goal is to develop the skill to become like that by practicing the various different things you need to practice. Whereas faking it is, I'm trying to throw the wool over people's eyes and pretend that I'm someone that I'm not. And I believe that what's really critical for us to be happier, as well as for us to really build better relationships overall, we need to allow the world to see more of us. Because if we spend a lot of time signaling to the world just how amazing we are, we spend all of that effort, all of that energy trying to let other people know how brilliant we are. And by the way, it's a normal thing to some degree. But when we care so much about how everyone sees us, when we care so much about the perception people have about whether or not we're successful, what that leads us to doing is it means that now we export how lightly we are to be happy. We export the locus of happiness to other people's perception of us. And that's a problem. Because as soon as we allow the world to tell us whether or not we're supposed to feel happy, now all of a sudden we're the victims. Now all of a sudden we're telling ourselves stories that I cannot be happy unless I'm accepted. And that means we start to look at our Instagrams and our TikToks and our Facebooks, and we start to see the amount of likes we get or don't get. And we start to take that as a declaration as to whether we're good enough. And that's a problem. There's a great book written recently about the anxious generation, written by Jonathan Haidt. Wonderful book. Definitely recommend it. And in it, one of the things he talks about is from 2010 to 2015, there was a huge drop in terms of the mental health of a lot of people, especially teenage girls. And one of the main reasons, the two main reasons that are cited, one is the evolution of selfies, where we're constantly taking selfies and therefore we're extra aware of how we look. And we're constantly using filters and whatnot to try to make sure we look a certain way. And the other is social media and the constant reinforcement about whether or not we're good enough based upon the external validation that we get from other people. And this has to stop. We have to stop allowing the world to validate us or not, and allow our own happiness and our own self-confidence to be influenced by what everyone else says. The easiest thing in the world is to go online and to attack other people and to troll and to say nasty things. And so what we do is we look at the world and we're afraid to put stuff out. And when someone says something nasty, it hurts so much more than how good we feel when someone says something positive. But that's people doing therapy on themselves. Whenever a troll attacks you, that's because they feel shitty about themselves. And they're just trying to feel better by bringing you down because that's all that they've learned. They go, if I feel terrible, everyone else should feel terrible. As opposed to what really needs to happen, which is we need to start to give each other more of a break. We need to support each other more. And that doesn't mean lying to each other and pretending someone's amazing when they're not acting amazing, but it means being there for each other and most importantly, being there for yourself. And as I pivot away from this lecture about what we should be doing back to reading people, it's so important that you recognize that everybody is just trying to position themselves in a certain way. And being authentic means allowing yourself to be you, to share your vulnerabilities, to share the fact that you don't have everything perfect. But it also means spotting it in other people. And to me, I gravitate towards authentic people. I don't gravitate always towards super polite people or very nice people or very caring people. I gravitate towards real people. And that's because with real people, you know exactly where you stand and you're being given the greatest gift in the world. They're sharing who they are. And it doesn't mean they don't signal, but they don't over signal too many times in too many ways to try to prove that they're a certain type of person. Lastly, to walk you through strategies to read people better, read the person. So body language, their voice tone, the accent, what they're wearing, what their words are, what they're saying, what they're not saying, all that sort of stuff. Read the signals. What are they trying to say to you? What are they trying to tell you about themselves? Read the agenda. What goal do they have in this conversation? Read the timing and the context. So the timing and the context is what happened just beforehand, what's going to happen, when are they communicating, does that have any factor? And that's a part of the context. What are all the other contextual variables that can help inform why they're doing what they're doing? So that's it. This is all about how to read people better. I know that unfortunately I haven't been able to tell you how to read people's minds just yet. But until I figure that out, I believe that if you can put into practice even a fraction of what we covered on this episode, you will be much more effective at being able to read people, figure them out, understand them, and therefore build prosperous, incredible relationships which allow you to live happy ever after. May you read people better. May you share and like and tell people and subscribe to the podcast. May everything go well for you, and may the force, as always, continue to be with you. Thanks very much. There's a video that I highly recommend you go back and check. It is one of the previous episodes on the podcast, and I think you're going to love it. But for now, take care, be well, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.